Game made by one person. How many people work on Sega's Sonic games? With how much money again? Because give one guy Unity and he does a much better job. Spark 2, Electric Jester Boogaloo. This is a game I had been waiting for probably about 15 years at least, without even knowing this was a thing. I mean, how could I? It was 15 years after I first desperately needed it in my life. It is something that filled a very important void in my heart and life, and I mean, this was effectively my game of the year for 2022, along with its predecessor and sequel. It's a very, very good game. Not perfect, but something that was very meaningful to me, certainly. But we'll get into why in a little bit. The story to Spark 2 takes place a little bit after the first game, and I hope you're not expecting to see too much Spark in this Spark game, because outside of one static image and I think being offhandedly mentioned in 3 lines of dialogue, he is completely absent from this game. I mean, the loading screens themselves call this game Fark the Electric Jester for a reason. It stars the titular series clone and best boy, Fark. But that's sort of his problem. He doesn't know who he is. In fact, the only name he has was a goofy one given to him by that other yellow guy, and that was literally just to call him a faker. His entire identity is entirely encompassed by this other person who he's supposed to be an emulation of. And what's probably even more gut-wrenching is the fact that that guy, who he's a knockoff clone of, stole his entire life's purpose and mission. Now he has no identity of his own, no life purpose, no idea why he's on this planet, and he has no direction. He is alone and terrified. Fortunately, Dr. Armstrong, that guy from 2 cutscenes in the first game, says he might be able to peer through Fark's code and figure out exactly who he is and what his real name and identity are. Except that a dollar store knockoff of Fark shows up and kidnaps him. And now Fark has to go on a quest to save his identity. Also, the villain Freom's back, so now Fark can fulfill his lifelong goal of putting that guy in the ground. Basically, if Spark the Electric Jester was Sonic the Hedgehog, then Fark the Robot Electric Jester is if Sonic had this sort of edgy knockoff character that had to suffer an existential crisis and go on an adventure to try and solve that problem. Oh wait. Okay, except that this is a good game, and it doesn't completely destroy his character arc from the first game. Actually, thinking about it, making Fark the focus of this game's story, I think was a really good idea. I've always sort of thought that Fark was a far more interesting character than Spark, and not just because he's a cool robot or anything. I mean, there is that, but more that, especially in this game, you get more of a sense of a character from him. Now, maybe it was just the way the first game portrayed its characters or whatever, but I felt like the first game, Spark was more or less just an avatar for the player. Sure, he had moments where he interacted with other characters, and he had an initial motivation to actually go on an adventure, but to me, it just felt like a flimsy reason to start an adventure, and then he just did it because he had nothing better to do. Here, Fark actually feels like he has far more of a character than his actual biological counterpart. You get a sense of a far deeper character within the metal shell. I mean, one quick look at him and his big spiky maw, you think he might be just some sort of violent war machine monster, and yet he couldn't really be farther from the truth. Very early on, you get a sense that this guy, the moment that the doctor reveals that he might be able to reveal something about Fark to him, Fark excitedly hops up off the table and jumps on him saying, "Yes, please do that, I need to know about myself." Later on, he interacts with Romulo, the silly guy from the first game, although he's significantly less silly here, and Romulo expresses that he has no interactions with Fark in his entire life, but he knows about him through the other yellow guy. And knowing that his entire identity is linked to someone that he is only known as a knockoff of, even in his own story, in a game where he doesn't even appear, he cannot escape the shadow of his biological counterpart that came before him. Fark is always stuck in Spark's shadow, and he has no way of defining himself or moving beyond that simply by virtue that he looks like him. And throughout the game, you see that if his identity is redefined, it's always simply through the context of someone else, but never his own person. In a world that is trying its damnedest to tell him He is no one, simply someone else's shadow. He frustratedly threatens Romolo to get information to not only save this doctor's life, but to get the answers he desperately wants. And when he finally gets him, he apologizes for having to have done that. He feels remorse because he doesn't want to come across as just a war machine. For a robot that was designed basically just to kill someone, and one who has been defined only as a knockoff of someone else, he is desperately trying to be more than the monster he was designed to be, and more than the person he looks like. He's desperately trying to find his own path in life, and there's so many little details in the world and his actions, and even just the lyrics in the vocal tracks in this game that hint to a far more deep internal conflict in this character. If you actually listen to the lyrics of the vocal tracks, you can hear that he is struggling to get out of Spark's shadow, and more importantly to him, he's struggling with the concept that he might have zero agency in his own life. There's a great sense of internal turmoil and anxiety for him, that he's always constantly feeling like, from the moment he was created to this moment, the adventure he's on right now, he is a puppet dancing on someone else's string, and every step of the way it is continually being proven time and time again that this was all pre-planned from the start, and he's simply following a script that was laid out for him, and that he ultimately has no free will or agency in his life. And saying this all out loud is sending me into my own existential crisis of how I'm not very good at anything, and I'm gonna just keep pushing so hard at the one thing I'm actually good at and get nowhere. Oh god, let's change the subject. So let's talk about the other characters. Well, for one thing, there are quite a few of them. Romolo's back for a few cutscenes, and he's not as silly as he was before. Like I said, now he's just sort of cute mascot Jan. But he's now teamed up with another character named Astra, who is a terrible example of this because honestly, I've played through this game a couple times and I forget she's even a part of this game. But there's also a team of robotic mercenaries that are working for Freon, and they are very clearly deeply interpersonally connected to each other. They refer to each other as friends, and through cutscenes you actually get to see their connections, little by little fleshing themselves out. And when they interact with Fark, you really kind of see who they are and what they meant to each other. And then of course you have EJ, the knockoff dollar store brand Fark, who is having his own existential crisis, being stuck in Fark's shadow of all things. And he comes across as such a big villain until he turns out to be a total mook and has even less going on than Fark does. And that's a true existential nightmare right there. And then of course you've got Freon and his mysterious plans for Fark and how they're truly connected. This game is a high-speed action platformer. There's not really all that much of a story, and yet the kind of characterization they have in here and how they've created these deeply personal connections that you can feel even if they're not expressly spoken are tangible. I think the developer really did create a series of interesting characters, and deeply interesting ones, with actually some emotional pathos. But maybe I'm just projecting and I just like a little yellow robot guy that I desperately want 12 action figures of right now. Now, the gameplay to Spark the Electric Jester 2 is pretty awesome and appeals very, very much to me specifically. I said this in the review of the first game, but whereas Spark the Electric Jester 1 could be summed up as Sonic Advance meets Kirby, this one is closer to Sonic Adventure 2 meets Devil May Cry, and it's awesome for it. Unlike the first game, this is fully transitioned into a 3D game, and it, for the most part, works really, really well. Fark, as a character, has quite a impressive range of movements available to him. He can run, he can jump, he can dash, he has the ability to air dash. He has a charge dash as well as a charge drop to allow you to make descents really quickly, although it only comes up like once or twice. I forget that that ability is even there most of the time. And even in his base moveset, he has quite a few combat abilities to his name. He has a light attack, a heavy attack. He, of course, can combo those abilities together, as well as build up a combo meter. As you build that combo meter up, you will do more damage, but you can also expend that combo meter into a charge attack, which, depending on your form, can do quite a lot of things, from doing a lot of damage to your opponent to healing yourself, as well as a few different buff abilities, depending on which form you take. And between the first game and the second game, Fark has absolutely retained his parry, which is vital for the boss fights, to say the least. And the parry system itself is reworked to be a lot more generous depending on which difficulty you play on. On the hardest setting, your parry only lasts, I think, something like 3 or 4 frames. It's very, very precise and you have to time it super well. But on the easier settings, you can actually hold that down for like 3 or 4 seconds before you get a overheat and you have to wait a second to use it again. You know, the first time I played this, I was actually playing on the hardest difficulty. I got really used to having to perfect time my parries, to the point where when I streamed this on the easier setting, I was thrown off by the fact that I could actually hold the button down, and that really threw off my timing on stuff. But yeah, if you're not so good at action games, you can actually just hold down the parry, and for the most part, the game is wildly generous about it. If you're not super good at action games, but you want the high-speed platforming, this game's got it in spades and will cover you on the harder fights. And utilizing that parry well will get you through certain environmental obstacles, as well as build up your combo meter, as well as your score multiplier. So if you're going for score medals, you're going to need to rely very heavily on that parry in order to get those scores as high as possible. And trust me, if you want those score medals, it's going to take some effort. The high scores that the developer set in this game for speed and score are real high. New to this game, Fark is also adding a homing attack to his repertoire, which allows him to take out smaller enemies and to utilize enemies as bridges across gaps without having to worry about spatial relationships and navigating mid-air while potentially falling to his death. It's very generous to utilize this, and it works really well, but it's not super overpowered. It can only be used against the super small enemies that will die in one hit from it. So most regular other enemies will be completely unaffected by this homing attack. It's not a catch-all, beat-all, end-all ability. They definitely want you to utilize the combo system and actually use your weapons and combos in different forms to take out the stronger threats. Like the previous game, however, there are also forms which will change how you play. However, there is a huge difference between the first game's number of abilities and this game's. It's been a little while since I played the first game, but there was at least a dozen in that game. In this one, there's like 6. And this is a trend that will continue into the next game. If I remember correctly, I read that the developer had trouble utilizing all the different forms and abilities in meaningful ways, so there was a lot of redundancy and stuff. So he cut down on the number of forms, and this would continue to the next game to the point where the next game has 1. You can really feel that here. Now, what is nice is you can hold up to 3 forms at once on Fark, plus his standard form. They are mapped to the D-pad, and as you pick up a new one, it will swap the one you currently have out. Those forms are the sword form, gives you a little bit extra reach, a little bit extra damage. Its charge ability gives you a speed boost, which makes it a great all-roundy ability. There's the hammer, which gives you a slower, more damaging attack, but again, sword already gives you more damage and a speed boost if you charge it, so that's kind of out the window. There's a power armor form, which looks awesome, but it gives you like a slight hover, which isn't all that useful considering you already have a dash that can be used in the air, and its ability is just sort of a energy field around you, but you're very rarely ever surrounded by enemies, so it doesn't really get all that much use. It's a form that mostly just looks cool. You have a jet bike mode, which I didn't really find much use in at all, but he gets a cool bomber jacket, so there's that. And finally, you have edgy mode, which gives you hovering roller skates, almost like a different character entirely, and a little knife. But more importantly, it gives you a double jump and a triple air dash, which, when combined with your charge dash, can pretty much get you from point A to point B without ever touching the ground. Like, seriously, if you know how to use this, you can get around the entire first level without, like, ever touching the main level. It's kind of ridiculously awesome. And then there's one other form, but that's a story thing that you get way at the end, so I won't spoil it. But I will reiterate, I need, like, 12 action figures of that right now because it looks cool. So anyone out there with a 3D printer, hook me up. Seriously. I need figures of that last form. But to reiterate, this is ultimately probably why there aren't that many different forms, because there just isn't all that many different ways to differentiate them or make them meaningful, especially when there are 2 that just kind of completely make the rest useless. But it's at least nice that this game continues the trend of having different forms and giving you different combat and environmental options. And the fact is, Fark himself already has a really cool set of abilities. His combo system is fantastic, and the way his different forms can be utilized in comboing and environmental stuff really does make it feel meaningful, and it's fun to explore these things. It's just kind of a shame that there's so few options and that there's like a beat the game combat form and a beat the game environmental form that kind of makes the rest pointless. That said, outside of a couple of combat arenas, there's not really a lot of times where you need to fight things, and because it's a game about going at high speeds around stuff, but with this being kind of inspired by Sonic Adventure, yeah, you don't really need to ever actually fight things outside of when this game puts a combat arena around you, which is only like 3 times, and then boss fights. Indeed, you don't even really need to invest that heavily into all the different combos and stuff that each form has, because, at least as I found, just spamming light attack is more than enough to get you through pretty much any fight, even on the hardest settings, provided you know when to like parry, because on the hardest settings you die in 2 hits. Now that said, when I do compare this to Devil May Cry, I mean that in the sense that there is spectacle, there's high-speed combos, and, you know, there's cool moves that make you feel powerful and awesome. It's not a super highly polished combat system, you know? There's not combat rankings, and there's not enemy reactions based on how much you damage them. Like, there's no juggling or anything. But at the same time, this is a game made by one guy. I think I can let that slide. The environments themselves are designed in such a way that it really does emphasize exploration. There are collectibles in these environments, and they don't just give you score. They do that, but there are bits of hidden artwork you can find, and secret routes that are hidden in places. In the very first stage, there are a bunch of buildings way off in the distance, like a mile out there. If you can get out there, you will find that there are springs and collectibles and points and stuff just out there for the picking if you can find a way to get there. If any other developer made a game like this, they would immediately take Collision away from that, because all that would do would slow the game down. But Fatbird decided, hey, people are going to find a way to get out here. Let's give them something to find, you know? Let's reward and encourage exploration of my world. And it feels good as someone who loves to explore and loves the momentum and movement mechanics of this game. It just genuinely feels like a treat to explore this game. The stages themselves are an absolute delight to run through, hitting high speed thrusters, bouncing off springs, getting launched into the air. That said, whenever the game tries to play around with gravity or running up vertical walls, which, I mean, there is one stage that's entirely based around that, the game sometimes has trouble figuring out exactly how gravity should work. One of the later levels, the Planetary Stripe, named because it's the stripe around the planet, although I will contest this because if you look in the background, you see both the planet and its stripe. Not sure what you're running on now, because it sure as hell ain't the Planetary Stripe, but I digress. It's a level that is all about mixing and matching gravity. You'll like teleport and like the world will like shift 90 degrees and stuff, and that is great, except sometimes the game kind of forgets to shift the gravity or forgets like what way the gravity needs to face, and then you kind of have to just sort of platform on the side of stuff. It doesn't happen too frequently. I think in like the 4 or 5 playthroughs I've had of this game, it's only happened once or twice, but still it's a bit annoying when it happens. And when the game decides to go entirely vertical, well, that has the problem of any game trying to go vertical, and that means if you fall down, you are in for a bad time. Fortunately, it doesn't happen all that frequently, and when the gravity flipping mechanics do work, it does come across as a really fun technical flex by the developer, and it is a neat way to continue to explore this world and see it from a different angle than you might necessarily have originally looked at it. And that's great. The bosses to Spark the Electric Jester 2 are phenomenal. I mean, the first one is basically the first boss from both stories of Sonic Adventure 2. It's a big stompy mech that you can punch in the face and parry your way through combos. There's a lot of really cool bosses in this game, and fighting them is an absolute treat, but there are 2 things I did note about this that I should bring up. First of all, I believe 2 specific bosses, there is a bit of a photosensitivity issue that I should bring up. Fortunately, it doesn't last half as long as like the first game, which had an entire level of photosensitivity. That sucked. Here, it's a bit unpleasant, and if you are super photosensitive, you'll probably want to skip this all the same, but it's not long-lasting, so if you're only like mildly photosensitive like me, you can probably get through it just fine. I didn't really find myself having any headaches playing this game, but still just be aware of that. There are like 2 bosses that bring that up. The other issue I have is with one specific boss, and that's Float. She has a move that kind of breaks established mechanics. This game utilizes a warning sound effect and a color flash whenever anything tries to damage you. It's so that, you know, if you don't necessarily see something, you can hear something and get ready with a parry. She has a move that doesn't actually do that, and every other thing in the game does, so it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Now, that's not to say that that attack has no tell or anything, it absolutely does, but the established mechanics that this game actually gives you are completely contradicted with this one singular move. And perhaps what's most frustrating about this is if you're playing on the hardest difficulty, like I did the first time I played this game, you have 2 health, and it's a 3-hit attack. If you get hit by the first projectile of this attack, just as your invulnerability wears off, you will get hit by the third one, which means this move can one-shot you on the hardest difficulty without really telling you when it's going to happen. That's not great. Fortunately, nothing else in the game does that, but still, it's one weird inconsistency with the rest of the game. The only other thing about this game I dislike is, from what I can tell, something in the control settings you can change, but it's not necessarily clear. The first time I played this game, I noticed that the character controlled really weird. It's kind of hard for me to explain. It's like the controls were like very unresponsive, and from what I can tell, this is tied to the movement smoothing option, which doesn't explain itself in any meaningful way. As I understand, the movement smoothing option is basically to kind of keep the player on rails for high-speed segments and loops and stuff, so you don't crash into a wall and then like fall to your death or something. So something like that, sort of guiding your character so you don't die because like physics or your own ineptitude in controlling your character. Like something like that makes sense, but it feels overly controlling at times. So you should probably turn that down a little bit. I ended up turning it almost off, because if it's entirely off when you go on loops and stuff, it's actually very easy to fling yourself off of loops. Like, that's why this setting exists. But at least from what I found, in the default setting, it's fighting the game to actually control your character. So yeah, maybe take a look at the smoothing settings, and you might have to tweak some things there to find a really comfortable experience. I'm still not 100% sure I've found what works for me, but it seems like turning that down a lot really does help, and it does seem to be tied mostly to keeping players on track during moments of loop-de-loops and moments where the gravity flips the character upside down. I get why it's there, it's important it's there, it's just poorly explained and probably tuned to be a little bit too powerful in guiding the player. But overall, Spark the Electric Jester 2 just feels good, you know? Like I said during my Game of the Year list, I can't describe this anything beyond it's a feeling, and I know I'm not exactly doing my job right by doing that. Moving around brings so much joy to my heart, and it feels genuinely, viscerally fun to do. I think that just navigating this world with this character is fantastic, and it just feels good. If you wanted a 3D Sonic game where you don't feel like you're entirely on rails, well, this game does it fantastically. The overall presentation to Spark the Electric Jester 2 is phenomenal. First of all, everything looks great. Spark looks absolutely adorable, and I love him. And to reiterate, his final form is so cool, I need 12 action figures of that right this instant. Seriously, it's such a cool form, it would be a waste not to make an action figure of it, and I need all of them. But the other individual characters all look quite good. Romolo looks just as cute as he did in the first game. The different mercenaries all look quite cool. I really love Float's design. She's a really cool character. The other bosses are fantastic. The generic enemies all have a lot of personality and look quite cool too, and they look very similar to the first game, thus giving you a really nice sense of continuity that this is the same world. And speaking of the worlds, well, I love the stage of this game. Floresta Blanca is the most Sonic the Hedgehog ice level you will ever find. Like, seriously, it is a beautifully designed ice stage. It has floating spiked logs that swing back and forth across environments as robots try and shoot you down. You have to platform across little individual platforms. It feels just absolutely true to the original core concept that Spark was built on, which is, you know, let's make something that's vaguely Sonic-like. If you ever want to see a Sonic ice stage, and for as cool as the, you know, awesome rock track of Ice Cap was in Sonic Adventure, that didn't feel like all that much of a Sonic stage. Here, this feels like they took an old school designed Sonic stage with those sensibilities and just translated it into 3D, and it works fantastically. Its follow-up level, Castella Blanca, is my favorite level in the game, and it uses like all these cool teleporters, platforms that appear and disappear as you get close to them, and it just feels like the world is morphing around you. It's such a cool technical level. Everything about this game looks phenomenal. And the soundtrack, holy crap, the soundtrack is fantastic. First of all, it uses some remixes from the first game, and they're really well done. The title screen theme is literally just Spark's theme from the original game, but that is in and of itself a hard rock remix of Spark's theme, so that works out pretty well. But the very first stage of this game uses a remix of the first stage from the first game, thus giving you a bit of audible continuity between the first and second game. Again, making you feel like you are in the same continuous world as the first game. But this time, it's more of a rock rendition, which really lends itself to the theme of being a, you know, harder metallic character. You know, he feels more metal, for lack of a better term, than Spark ever did. The music accompanies this, and it feels really, really good and like it fits his character. The second stage utilizes a different remix of that same song, and it is, of all 4 versions of that song across the series, what I would consider to be the definitive version of it. Castilla Blanca's soundtrack is an absolute jam. Technoria City's music is like this fantastic electronic synth, like rave jam that is awesome. And oh yeah, I kind of mentioned this before, but there are vocal tracks in this game, and they're right up there with the hard rock and cheese of the best of Crush 40. And as someone who's a big fan of Crush 40, that is awesome to me. And like I said all the way back at the top, the lyrics in the individual fight songs mesh really well with sort of telling a story of Fark's internal conflict and, you know, who he is as a character, which makes it even more meaningful when you get to the final boss theme that actually sort of closes out his arc and makes his character whole. It tells a continuous story in the smallest details. And what's really cool is every boss actually has 2 versions of the fight song playing at the same time, but cross-fades them to the vocal track when you get your enemy down to half health. It makes the final half of the fight, which is sometimes when they power up, you know, feel a lot more intense and awesome and like you're gaining the upper hand, but, you know, don't get too cocky because this could get worse. You know, it does make your fights feel all the more awesome and hard rockin'. I gotta admit, I will belt out the lyrics to these boss fight songs when I play this game just because they are so good. The soundtrack is awesome. Now, if you want a copy of Spark the Electric Jester 2 Fark Harder on Steam, it is $13, but you can also get it in a bundle and get all 3 games at once. And hey, you know, if you're not a PC gamer guy, I get it. I'm definitely like that too. This was actually put out on the Xbox One. Granted, it's a little bit more expensive at about $20, but I will say it lets you play this game on a console, and that's good. Now, ultimately, do I recommend you buy Spark the Electric Jester 2? Well, that's quite a question, and it's one you're going to have to ask yourself a little bit. I know that's not exactly the greatest answer. There's a bit of a wrench in the works. See, the developer, in his awesomeness, decided to include pretty much all the stages of this game for free into the 3rd game. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same because the fact is they removed the story and the boss fights, it's just the stages, and it's running with the 3rd game's logic and rules, which changes some things. For example, there are absolutely no power-ups, which changes some things about it. I mean, it means that you can't fling yourself across the first stage without ever touching the ground, for one thing. But for another, it also means that it adds falling damage, which actually makes one specific level's ending real tough, because the way it's designed is to make a very large fall that in the 3rd game will kill you. You can get around that, I mean, I have, but the fact is it doesn't work as well. The fact is you can get the bundle for almost the same price as just buying the 3rd game anyway, but you will get all the levels of the 2nd game in the 3rd game, so it's really a call you have to make on your own as to whether or not Fark's individual character arc is worth the purchase. Personally, I would argue yes, but that's because I love Fark as a character. He's a fantastic little robot guy, and I love him with all my heart. But I will say that I do love Spark the Electric Jester 2. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle was the very first GameCube game I ever owned. I broke the in-game clock with how many hours I have logged in that game. I am one of the top experts on game facts for answers for that game because I spent so much time with the A-Life system. I always wanted a Sonic Adventure 3 and I did not get it until I played Spark the Electric Jester 2. This is truly the Sonic Adventure 3 I always wanted, and arguably more. It actually tells a meaningful story with actually deep characters, with an actual arc. It has fun mechanics, a pretty solid combat system, great levels, fun forms that change how you play. And like I said with the first game, Sonic fans are ultimately not that hard to please. They just want really solid platforming, and if they can make it happen at a relatively decent clip, that's really all you need. You don't need all these gimmicks that Sega keeps wanting to shove in your faces. The fact is, this entire series was made by someone who understood Sonic games far better than Sonic's actual creators. Took it upon himself to, with the power of Unity, make something truly meaningful and make something infinitely better than Sega's been putting out. It just makes me once again say that Sonic should really just go to the fans because the fans are the only people who know how to do it right. And as someone who always wanted a Sonic Adventure 3, Spark the Electric Jester 2 is a dream come true to me. This was part of my game of the year for 2022, and for good reason. It's not a perfect game, it's got some issues, but it gives something to me that hit me very emotionally quite hard, and it made me smile far harder than I have in a very long time, just because it did something so meaningful to me. And maybe this game will be just as meaningful to you. And Fark, he gives a little bow. This is such an adorable little game.